The metallic taste hit first. Copper and electricity like licking a battery while my tongue swelled to twice its size. Then came the sound, not the hum of the centrifuge or the sterile buzz of fluorescent lights, but a wet, desperate wheeze coming from my own throat. My hands, steady enough to pipette nanolighters an hour ago, now clawed at my collar as the lab tilted sideways. I remember thinking, with the kind of absurd clarity that comes before darkness, this is histamine, just biochemistry, mast cells degranulating, nothing spiritual about suffocation. Even as I fell, I was categorizing my own demise. The floor was cold. I could feel the linoleum against my cheek, still smell the faint ammonia from the morning cleaning crew. Somewhere above me, my graduate assistant Priya was screaming into a phone. Her voice sounded like it was coming through water. I wanted to tell her the EpiPen was in the second drawer, under the old petri dishes, but my jaw had locked shut. Anaphylaxis. I diagnosed myself. Probably the new antibody serum we'd been testing on the stem cell cultures. Ironic, really. 30 years studying the machinery of life, and I'd be taken down by an immune system doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. Overreact and destroy the host to save it. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was my own hand, palm up, fingers still twitching. I noticed, with the detached fascination of a dying scientist, that I could see the veins beneath the skin, blue rivers carrying poisoned blood. Then nothing. Let me take you back 6 months before the lab, before the allergic reaction that wasn't really about allergies at all, back to when I still believed I had reality figured out. I was standing in front of 400 undergraduates in the main lecture hall, my book projected on the screen behind me. The Elegant Accident, with that glossy cover showing a DNA helix dissolving into cosmic dust. It had been on the bestseller list for 16 weeks. My publisher loved me. The atheist conference circuit paid me $20,000 per keynote. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd said that day, letting my voice echo off the acoustics they'd spent millions perfecting. You are a statistical miracle, but you are not a divine one. I clicked to the next slide. Raw data, mutation rates, genetic drift models. Your DNA is a drunk stumbling through a casino, hitting the slot machine just right every few million years. You are the result of copying errors, cosmic radiation, and pure dumb luck compounded over 4 billion years. There is no author. There is no intent. There is only chemistry time and the brutal filter of natural selection. A kid in the third row had raised his hand, probably 20 years old, still soft with the faith his parents had packed along with his dorm room bedsheets. Professor Hellsing, what about the precision? The way DNA encodes proteins with zero tolerance for error, how does randomness create a language that specific? I'd smiled then, not kindly. The same way a river creates a canyon, son. It doesn't plan the shape as it just cuts where it can. We're looking at 4 billion years of failures you don't see because they're dead in the dirt. You're asking why the lottery winner had the right numbers. The answer is someone had to win eventually, and the trillions who lost aren't here to argue. The kid had nodded slowly, but I could see I'd killed something behind his eyes. Good, I'd thought. Better a hard truth than a comfortable fairy tale. I'd lost my own daughter to a comfortable fairy tale. Emma, 8 years old, with her mother's dark hair and my unfortunate tendency to ask questions that had no good answers. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the doctors had said, using the same flat tone I now used in my lectures. A mutation in her blood cells, random, meaningless, brutal. I'd spent 18 months trying to save her. Mobilized every contact in genetic research, called in favors from labs in Switzerland, Singapore, Houston. Poured over her genome sequencing like a man possessed, looking for the error in the code, the typo in the great cosmic manuscript that had sentenced my daughter to a slow fade. Nothing. The mutation was there, embedded in her cells like a signature on a death warrant, and all our science, all our understanding of base pairs and transcription factors meant exactly nothing. She died on a Tuesday. Her mother found religion. I found rage. I wrote The Elegant Accident during the year after Emma's funeral, every chapter a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the universe's cruelty. If there was no designer, there was no one to blame. If we were just chemistry, then Emma was just chemistry that had stopped working. It wasn't personal. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a lesson or a test, or any of the nauseating platitudes people had whispered at the memorial service. It was just cells dividing wrong. The book made me famous, made me powerful in certain circles. I became the champion of the rational, the patron saint of the cosmically disappointed. Every debate I won, every believer I dismantled with cold logic and colder data, I was really arguing with the God I didn't believe in, the one who'd let Emma's cells forget how to stop multiplying. So there I was 6 months later, in my lab at 11 p.m., still trying to prove the universe was an accident, still trying to make Emma's senseless ending make sense by making everything senseless. The serum was supposed to tag specific genes in stem cells, make them light up under the microscope so we could watch them differentiate in real time. Priya had left hours ago. I should have waited for her, should have followed protocol. But I'd seen something in the preliminary slides that afternoon, a pattern in the gene expression that didn't fit the models, something that looked almost like rhythm, like syntax. I'd injected the serum into my sample, leaned into the microscope and felt the needle prick my thumb through the glove. One small puncture. 60 seconds later, my throat was closing. I wasn't dead, I was dimensional. That's the only word that fits even now. I didn't leave my body. I expanded beyond the concept of having one. The lab ceiling dissolved like sugar in water, and I was rising but not up, rising inward, falling upward, moving in directions that don't exist on any axis I'd ever taught. The pull was magnetic but softer, like being remembered by something vast. Then I saw it. The tunnel everyone talks about, except it wasn't a tunnel. It was a spiral, a double helix made of light, rotating slowly, impossibly huge, stretching into forever. I could see the base pairs, not as molecules, but as musical notes. Adenine humming to thymine, guanine singing to cytosine. The code of life, but alive, conscious, joyful. You always knew, a voice said. Not words, frequency, pure meaning poured directly into whatever I was now. To knew what? I tried to say, but I had no mouth. That language implies a speaker. The helix opened and I fell through. I landed, if landing is the word, in my own memory. Except I wasn't watching it. I was inside it, living it from every angle simultaneously. There, the lecture hall 6 months ago, the kid in the third row asking about precision in DNA. But now I could feel him. Not just see him, feel his hope, fragile and bird-boned, cupped in his hands as he'd raised that question. Feel his mother's prayers for him that morning, her fear that college would steal his faith. Feel his father's doubt, silent and cancerous, that maybe the professors were right and Sunday school was just stories. And I felt what I'd done to him. My answer, that cold surgical dismantling of wonder, landed in his chest like a stone. I felt his hope crack, felt the exact moment he decided that intelligence meant abandoning meaning, felt him go home that night and stare at his ceiling and think, if Professor Hellsing is right, what's the point of any of this? No, I tried to say. I was just teaching science. I was just... You were wounded, the voice said. So you wounded. The memory dissolved and another took its place. Emma's hospital room. Day 47 of treatment. I was holding her hand, the one without the IV, and she was asking me the question she'd asked 100 times. Daddy, why did my cells forget how to be good? I'd given her the same answer. Mutations, randomness, bad luck. But now I could feel what she'd actually heard. There's no reason, baby. Your suffering means nothing. You're just broken code. I watched her face, saw the light dim just a fraction. She'd wanted meaning. She'd wanted to know her pain had purpose, that it fit into something bigger than a genetic typo. And I, in my grief-armored certainty, had given her emptiness dressed as honesty. She forgave you instantly, the voice said. You're the only one who hasn't. Then the memory stopped, and I was in a space that wasn't space. Imagine standing inside a living library, where every book is a cell and every cell is a universe, and every universe is singing. That's close. Except the books were DNA strands, billions of them, rotating slowly in a grid of golden light that stretched infinitely in all directions. I was seeing the source code of creation, but it wasn't cold data. Each strand pulsed with intention. The sequences I'd memorized, ATCG, ATCG, they were spelling something. Not proteins, not just instructions for building bodies. They were spelling names. Your name, my name, Emma's name. Not the ones on birth certificates, but the real ones. The frequencies we'd agreed to carry before we became flesh. Each gene a syllable, each chromosome a verse. The so-called junk DNA that I'd dismissed as evolutionary debris, that was the poetry, the context, the love letters woven between the functional code. I reached out, or whatever passed for reaching in that space, and touched one strand. It exploded into knowing. I saw a woman in Mumbai, born with the same genetic mutation that had taken Emma. But her timeline was different. She lived, became a doctor, saved 17 children with the same condition. Her mutation wasn't a mistake. It was an antenna, tuned to pick up the frequency of compassion in a way that others couldn't access. Her suffering had been the toll booth, not the destination. I touched another strand. A man in Copenhagen, paralyzed from birth. His broken genes had locked his body but cracked open his mind. He composed symphonies in his head, conducted with eye movements, that made people weep in languages they didn't speak. His limitation was his liberation. You're showing me exceptions, I argued, still the scientist. Outliers, what about the millions who just suffer and die? What about the children buried in mass graves? What about Emma? The voice was softer now, patient. Her strand appeared in front of me, and I knew if I touched it I'd understand. I'd see the pattern I'd been too broken to recognize, but I was terrified. Because understanding meant accepting, and accepting meant I'd been wrong. About everything. She chose this, the voice said gently. You both did. That's insane, I shot back. What child chooses leukemia? What father chooses to watch his daughter teach him the only lesson that could break his heart open? I touched her strand. And I saw it. The contract we'd signed in that space before names, before bodies, before time. She would come to me briefly, burn bright and fast. Her cells would betray her in a way that would force the great rationalist Marcus Hellsing to face the limits of his certainty. She would be the question I couldn't answer with equations. She would be my teacher, disguised as my daughter. And in the seeing I felt her, not dead, not gone, present in a way that made alive and dead seem like primitive categories. She was the same consciousness that had held my hand in that hospital bed, but now she was untethered, vast, joyful. You were so angry, Daddy, I heard her say, and it was her voice, but also the voice of the light, the DNA, the singing grid. You thought I was a mistake in the code, but I was the code, the message you needed most. What message? I was weeping now, except I had no eyes, no tears, just pure grief finally allowed to crack open into something else. That love doesn't need a reason, that meaning doesn't require perfection, that the signature, she touched my chest, or the space where my chest used to be, has always been written inside you. And suddenly I could see them, in every strand of DNA woven through every double helix in that infinite library, repeating patterns that weren't random, fractals of intention, mathematical poetry. The same signature, over and over and over, in every cell of every being that had ever lived. Not chaos. Not accident. Authorship. You have to go back. The voice was firm now. Not cruel, but absolute. The way gravity is absolute. No. My response was immediate, primal. I can't, I won't, there's nothing left for me there. Emma is here, the truth is here. If I go back, I'll forget. I'll fall asleep again. You won't forget. Not this time. Then let me stay. Let me be with her. I've spent 12 years in hell and you're showing me heaven and asking me to choose the cage again. I felt Emma's presence move closer, like sunlight through clouds. Daddy, you're not done reading the book yet. What book? The one you've been writing, in every cell, every choice. Every student you'll teach differently now. The grid of DNA strands around me began to pulse, synchronized, like a heartbeat made of light. And I understood. This wasn't observation. This wasn't a tour of the afterlife. This was recruitment. There are others like you, the voice said. Brilliant, broken, armored in rationality because they've been hurt by irrationality. They need someone who speaks both languages, someone who can show them that the microscope and the mystery aren't enemies. I don't know how to do that. Yes, you do. You've been doing it backwards for 12 years. And then, without warning, without mercy, I was ripped backward through the helix, through the light, through the dimensions that don't have names, and slammed back into meat. The first breath was agony. My lungs inflated like two balloons filled with glass shards. I could hear Priya sobbing, hear the paramedics barking medical codes, feel hands compressing my chest. Someone had cut my shirt open. The fluorescent lights were obscene, offensive, after the golden frequencies I'd been swimming in. "We've got a rhythm, he's back!" Back. The word felt like a prison sentence. I tried to speak, to tell them what I'd seen, but my throat was raw from the intubation tube. All that came out was a sound like a broken animal. Priya's face appeared above me, mascara streaked, her hands gripping mine so hard, I thought my fingers might break. "Professor, oh God, Professor, you were gone. You were gone for 9 minutes, the defibrillator. We shocked you 4 times. 9 minutes, I'd lived 9 eternities in 9 minutes. They loaded me into the ambulance. I watched the lab ceiling pass by one more time, saw my workstation with its microscope still humming, the slides still mounted, my blood still on the floor. Evidence of a before and after I could never explain in a peer-reviewed journal. The depression came 3 days after I was discharged. Not sadness. Mourning. Bone-deep cellular grief for a home I'd been exiled from. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, and the ceiling was an insult. Flat. Finite. A lid on a box when I'd been flying through infinite dimensions of meaning. Food tasted like cardboard. Conversations felt like watching television with the sound off. I was back in the cave and I could remember the sun. My colleagues visited, brought flowers and fruit baskets, and carefully avoided mentioning that I'd been clinically deceased for 9 minutes. Priya came by with my mail. 3 universities requesting speaking engagements, 2 interview requests from atheist podcasts, a letter from my publisher asking about the sequel to The Elegant Accident. I couldn't look at any of it. On the 5th night, I walked downstairs to my study. The fireplace was cold. I stood there in my pajamas, staring at the bookshelf where 20 copies of my own book stared back at me. That glossy cover, that arrogant subtitle, "Why We Are Nobody's Creation." I pulled one down, opened it to the dedication page. "For Emma, you deserved a universe with better code." The rage hit me like voltage. Not at God, not at the universe, at myself, for making her suffering meaningless, for wrapping my own cowardice in the language of rationality, for telling a dying 8-year-old that her pain was just a copying error, when she'd been trying to teach me the most important lesson in the cosmos, that love doesn't require comprehension. I walked to the fireplace, found matches in the drawer. My hands were shaking, but not from the lingering effects of anaphylaxis, from something older, something breaking open. I lit the corner of the book. The pages caught quickly, curling inward, the ink bubbling as the heat consumed my best arguments against meaning. I watched Chapter 3, The Myth of Irreducible Complexity, Blacken and Flake Away. Watched Chapter 7, Consciousness as Emergent Property, Dissolve into Ash. I'd been reading God's Signature for 30 years and insisted it was random ink stains. The fire burned itself out. I sat there on the floor until dawn, surrounded by the ashes of my certainty. It took me 6 months to find the courage. I walked back into that same lecture hall. Same 400 seats, but different students. Fresh faces who hadn't yet decided whether the universe cared about them. I stood at the podium. No slides this time, no book to sell. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, and my voice cracked slightly. "I've spent 30 years teaching you that DNA is nothing more than chemistry with delusions of grandeur, that you are accidents, beautiful, improbable accidents, but accidents nonetheless." I paused, looked at the kid in the 3rd row, different kid, same hungry eyes. I was wrong. You could hear the silence. Not wrong about the chemistry. The base pairs are still adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. The mutations are still random at the molecular level. Natural selection is still the filter, but I was wrong about what it means. I pulled up a slide, not data this time, a photograph I'd taken through my microscope the week before, a single human cell, magnified, with the DNA strands visible like threads of light. Here's what I couldn't see before. Language requires grammar, code requires syntax, and syntax, I felt my voice thicken, syntax requires intent. The patterns in your DNA aren't just functional, they're fractal, self-similar across every scale. The same mathematical signatures that show up in galaxies show up in your genes. The same ratios that govern seashells govern your protein folding. That's not random, that's not accident, that's style. That's... The kid raised his hand. I braced myself. "Professor Hellsing, are you saying you believe in God now?" I smiled, not the cruel smile from before, something softer. I'm saying I found a signature I can't explain away. Call it God, call it the source, call it the field of infinite intelligence. I don't care about the name. But something wrote this code. And that something doesn't just understand math and chemistry, it understands beauty, purpose, story. I clicked to the next slide. Emma's photo. 8 years old, holding a microscope I'd given her for her birthday. I had a daughter who was taken from us by a genetic mutation. For 12 years, I used her ending as proof that the universe was cruel and meaningless. But I was wrong about that too. My voice broke. I didn't hide it. Her mutation wasn't a mistake in the code. It was part of the message. And the message was, your need to understand doesn't override the reality of love. Your inability to see the pattern doesn't mean there isn't one. I looked directly at that kid in the third row. So here's what I'm teaching now. Science shows us the mechanics of the miracle, the how, but it will never tell you the why, because science is a language of measurement, and some things, love, meaning, purpose, they can't be measured. They can only be recognized. I closed my laptop. The signature is in your cells. You've been carrying the proof your whole life. The only question is whether you're brave enough to read it. That night I went back to my lab, pulled up Emma's genetic sequence on the screen, stared at the mutation that had ended her journey. And this time, instead of seeing error, I saw intention. Not cruel intention, not punishment, but a soul contract written in base pairs, a daughter who loved her father enough to break his heart open because it was the only way to crack his certainty. I'd spent 3 decades teaching students that we're accidents in a meaningless void. Now I spend every day teaching them that we're miracles in a meaningful mystery. The microscope didn't lie to me. I just wasn't looking closely enough. God's signature isn't in the sky. It's in your cells. It always has been.